One thing I want to mention before we get into brushes is the workspaces at the top of the Blender window. You'll notice there is a sculpting tab. If we switch to that, you see we've gone to sculpt mode and the interface has updated a little bit differently than simply the default layout tab where we switch to sculpt mode. You'll see that the timeline has disappeared in the sculpting workspace. Also on the right, you'll see that we have our tool settings in a vertical layout as opposed to the horizontal layout at the top of the 3D view. And this is the same settings, but just duplicated to be vertical, which is how the settings were in previous versions of Blender. And it's completely preferential if you want to go with the horizontal settings or the vertical settings. Personally, I like the horizontal at the top because it takes up less screen real estate. But if you want to go vertical, you might want to hide this. If you right click on the sculpt mode selection, you can go to header, show tool settings to disable it. Alternatively, if you're expecting to see that top shelf and it's not there, simply right click on sculpt mode, header, show tool settings to get it back. For me personally, I probably use the sculpting tab and simply switching to sculpt mode about 50-50. It's completely up to you what you want to do. For this video, we'll stick with the sculpting workspace and drag out my tool column again so that we can see our brush names. In the top bar up here, we have brush settings specific to each brush. And as I click through the list, you'll see that the defaults and some of the options appear or disappear depending on the brush that's selected. I'll simply start with the draw brush and go down the list. Also, something I want to preface is, like most things with Blender, there are tons of settings, many of which are only useful in specific situations or more advanced situations that you don't need to know with a fundamental introductory knowledge of sculpt mode. So you'll see me skip over several settings. I'm only going to focus on what I use regularly and what I think you need to know first and foremost. So let's start with the brush radius and strength settings. They're sliders that adjust how big or small your brush is, or how strong the effect of your brush is. These are the first two hotkeys I highly recommend you memorizing. F and drag your mouse will make it larger or smaller. Shift F and drag your mouse will make it stronger or weaker. So again, F for the size of your brush and Shift F for the strength of your brush. Note that the strength is denoted by the numeric value in the center, also by an inner circle. The larger that inner circle gets, the stronger the brush, the smaller it gets, the weaker the brush. This is way more intuitive to work with the hotkeys rather than coming up here and guessing what the radius and the strength should be. Although sometimes the strength you do like to set at a specific value. But by and large, you'll be navigating and sculpting on your mesh, changing these values on the fly. Next, we have a little plus and minus icon. Now, these are not available for all brushes, but it represents the direction of the effect, either additive with the plus or subtractive with the minus. Now, most brushes have an additive default, and the way that you reverse that effect is by holding Control. This is the third hotkey you definitely need to memorize. As you can see, with Control not held, we're pushing the effect out. With Control held, we're pushing it in. And you can also change the default behavior by choosing either the plus or minus. The only brushes that I'm aware that have a negative default is Draw Sharp and the Crease brush, which personally, I like to go ahead and change those back to plus as a default because my brain likes to think globally about that behavior regardless of the brush that's selected. However, with the grab brush, for example, that's not applicable there because it's just following your cursor if you're going out or you're going in. So you can see that setting disappears. Next, we've got the brush menu, which is an example of many settings that I rarely, if ever, touch. Though there are a few important ones that I regularly interact with. And the first one is topology auto masking. But to see what that does, I need a new object. So I'm going to get rid of our sphere and in object mode, hit Shift A, Mesh, and choose Monkey. All right, so also Control 3 to smooth it out and apply that modifier. Now, if we tab into edit mode, the reason this is applicable to the example is the eyeball meshes are separate mesh islands within the same object. So if we jump back to sculpt mode and I use the draw brush, by default, the sculpt brush will affect both mesh islands regardless of them being separated. However, if we go to that brush menu and enable auto topology or topology auto masking, if I start my stroke on the eye, it will be limited to that mesh island, and same for the other mesh island. So this is a great way to sculpt on individual mesh islands at a time. Another setting that I use is the sculpt plane, but really I only adjust that for the scrape brush, but it is important and adds a lot of functionality, which we'll go over that once I get to the scrape brush. Front faces only is another useful check mark in here. So let's first start with that turned off. And if we go to the ear, let's say I want to plump up the top side of the ear like this, just pull it out a little bit. That looks fine from the front, but then if we look at the back, it's taking the back faces and pulling it with it, which is not what I want. I find this happens a lot when I'm sculpting ears. So let's undo that, and if we enable front faces only, it will ignore what's on the back side, which is what we want. So that one does come in handy, but these other ones, I find I rarely use them, so I'm going to skip them for the fundamental videos. Next, we've got the texture menu, which is, again, more of an advanced setting. It allows you to introduce texture images or procedural textures as like stamps for your brush. Again, very useful, but not in the early stages of sculpting. Next, we have the stroke menu, which again has a lot of specialized settings for specific situations. Not all that relevant to getting started with sculpting. However, I do want to show you how smooth stroke is effective in that it does exactly what you would think. It smooths out your stroke by dragging a line behind your cursor. So if we do that again, and you can increase the radius, it increases the size of that line that follows behind, which further smooths out your stroke. And I think that is something you'll find relevant as you get started. Next, for fall off, this controls the shape of your stroke in a way. So it starts with smooth, but there's a list that you can choose from. I think grab is probably most effective as an example. So that fall off is also smooth, which if we pull out a chunk like this, you can see it's a very smooth fall off. The shape that you pull out mimics what you see in the icon. So if we choose sharp, it's going to pull out very sharp. Now, I need probably more geometry to better showcase that. But if we choose constant, we're going to pull out kind of a layer, like a chunk in a extrude-like fashion. So the fall off does have a lot of power, but most often the default is going to work fine. With the grab brush, I actually do like to use a custom fall off, which is the smooth, and I pull that upper left corner, to the corner, that upper left hump to the corner. I just find that this makes a little bit more of an intuitive fall off for the grab brush. And then finally, display. This just controls a few settings for how your sculpt tools are displayed in the viewport. I've never touched those. So that's an overview of brush settings. Now we can go one by one through the brushes themselves and look at their behavior.